Mm-hmm.
So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, fundamentally, because Islam is entering somewhat of an epistemological crisis, and epistemology, if you're not familiar with the term, simply means the philosophy of knowledge or the science of knowledge, how that knowledge is received and worked upon and translated and somehow worked upon and worked with in any given society is what may be translated as epistemology, okay? Not to go too far into that, but the fact is that we have a tradition of madhahib, of the different Islamic madhab over the centuries, that themselves are basically post-revelatory constructions of knowledge, okay? They're knowledge bases, that's all that they are. They're collections of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, each madhab is its own collection of knowledge with its own kind of chain, okay, of teachers, and its own set of boundaries and to a certain extent also methodologies, okay? So if we just say 8 madhahib and we're talking about the 4 from Ahl Sunnah, the 3 from Ahlul Shi'at, and the Khariji Ibadi madhab, which is still present in Oman as far as today even. I mean, the king is Khariji, okay, of Oman. So, and then you have people saying Zahiri is a madhab, you have people saying Salafi is a madhab, whether that's true or not is another discussion. What is a madhab, again, is another discussion, okay? But you have a whole base of basically epistemological collections of Islamic knowledge that people today are referring to. Well, it's not only the madhab that constitute Islamic knowledge, but certainly the base for an alim would be to start with the madhab, okay? And of course, then you have on top of it, you have other forms of Islamic knowledge. You have kalam, you have hukma, you have ifan, you have tasawwuf, you have, usul al-fiqh and all of that kind of stuff. So you have all kinds of different forms of knowledge, okay? Now, what I mean by when I say Islam is in an epistemological crisis, what I'm saying to that, or what I'm referring to, is that in the past, especially in kind of predated, mainly agricultural-based societies, okay? Whatever the alim knew was perfectly sufficient for running 99.9% of the day-to-day of people's lives, okay? At least on a fundamentally structural kind of level. In other words, just with the collection of the ulama, okay, you could run a country, you could run a nation, you could run a tribe, you could somehow organize society, you could wage wars with other states, okay? Based on the fact that the sultan would always run back to the alim or the ulama to get the support that they need in order to wage their war, okay? Or if they wanted to raise taxes, then the sultan could go to the ulama and check the complicity, let's say the Sharia compliance, as it was called at the time, whether or not taxes could be raised or not. And many fundamental things could be managed by the ulama, okay? Because of the condition of knowledge. And also we have to remember that in those kind of past days, in most of those agrarian societies, only the ulama could read, okay? So nobody could read. Definitely no women could read, okay? But most men also could not read. They didn't want to read. Why? There are other things to do in life than read, okay? Many other things. So these were not knowledge-based societies in that sense. They were knowledge-based. Of course, they were knowledge-based and knowledge-driven. Let me correct that. They were not language-driven societies as much as we are today. We are very much a language-driven society today, and it's global, okay? Because nearly all of the knowledge that we use today, in contrast to the past, is language-based. At least at the level of running a nation, running a state, engaging with other parties, somehow trying to create a structure for, let's say, any community, really. You can call it the Muslims if you want to, or the Bukhari Zaydis, or whatever it is you want to call them, or the Shafi'i, yeah? It just doesn't matter what you call them, yeah? You need a very different type of knowledge today than you would have needed even just 2 centuries ago, even just 5, 6 generations ago. You need a completely different knowledge base, yeah? And you need a completely different approach to knowledge, and therefore, you know, different kind of, you can call them meta trends, are taking place on the level of epistemology or knowledge. If you look into what's happening now in the Islamic world, you have those which are conditioned to depend solely on the past, okay? So the only thing they're doing is looking at, you know, what does Quran say? What does Hadith say? What did the scholars say? What did they say 500 years ago? What did they say 800 years ago? And like this, they're trying to solve the problems, okay? You have most of the time, these guys of this first category, let's call them, you know, the traditionalists, most of the time they're not running any country, okay? They're academics. And thank God they're not running a country, because if they ran a country, it would be disaster, okay? Because there's absolutely no way to run a country like that. It's just impossible. It's not a matter of good or bad. No, it's not evaluation. It's simply impossible to do the job, yeah? You need a completely different set of knowledge today. Then you have those that went completely in the other direction. Let's call them the secularists. They tried to become completely independent of Islam in order to run the country, okay? If you look at Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, for example, okay? Mustafa Kemal was basically a soldier, a very good soldier, yeah? Who went through the ranks of the army until he basically became, you know, one of the top generals in the country, and he won the war in Çanakkale against the British. And there was basically blood all over the floor, but the Turks were able to defend the country, somehow driving out the French and the Greeks and the British in the aftermath of the First World War, and the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled according to Shariat for maybe a period of 500-600 years, not only in Turkey, but in the Levant and in many parts of North Africa as well, okay? So when that whole thing crumbled and Atatürk took over, he basically said, okay, you know what, guys? I'm finished with Islam. That's it. Because Islam is not going to bring us forward. So he took the epistemological crisis in completely the other direction. He went completely secular. And he even had the guys, you know, exchanging the fez for the French hat and so on, right? The French fedora and all that stuff. He banned the use of scarves for women at the universities. So if a woman, you know, but in the paradox to that, he made a program of literacy for the entire country, also the women. So, you know, Ataturk is like a mixed bag because he did many things in both directions, yeah? He preserved, on the one hand, he preserved the Sufi tekkes, so the centers of Sufi Islam, but he completely secularized them by imprisoning or sometimes even beheading the sheikhs and basically turning the Sufism in Turkey, or trying to turn it into basically like a whirling dervish kind of tourist attraction, okay?
Attractions.
Yeah, so So Ataturk took this completely in the other direction and basically tried to litterize and technologize entire country of Turkey. And he even switched the script, which was the Arabic-based Ottoman script, right? He switched it to the Latin-based left to right alphabet, right? So in the course of a generation, basically all of the previously learned Turkish ulama basically were rendered completely irrelevant, okay, in terms of knowledge, in terms of epistemology. And in Iran, Reza Shah Pahlavi tried to do the exact same thing. He failed, okay? As we know from the 1979 revolution, he failed. But he tried to do exactly the same thing. Which brings me to the third category, okay? Not the traditionalists, not the secularists, but the kind of, I don't even know how to put this. Let's call it maybe modern traditionalists, okay? So what Ruhollah Khomeini and the Iranian Shia basically tried to do, or are trying to do, their experiment kind of, basically what they're doing is cooking up an experimental kind of modernist, traditionalist Islamic laboratory over there in Iran, and trying to find a middle way between, you know, basing their way of governing the state and basically running the country on some kind of form of traditionalist Islam, while at the same time finding room and broadening the scope of theology just enough to include other sources of knowledge. You know, Iran has one of the top nuclear science programs right now in the Middle East. I would say after Israel, probably the best, right? You could argue. Okay, and it's based on their own scientists. They're not importing scientists. They're not getting Russians to come in and teach them. They're doing everything themselves. Why can they do it? Because they open their theology just enough to allow a certain amount of modern sciences and basically a modern base of science to enter the theology and be accepted within the theological state. Okay? The fourth, and we can debate for a long time whether the Iranian experiment is working or not, okay? It would take too long for today. But that's what's going on in Iran, okay? The fourth category are those that are trying to somehow run the state in a secular manner, but still pretend that Islam is important, okay? So this is maybe like Indonesia, for example, yeah? Indonesia is maybe a good example of this today. Yes, they run a very multi-religious, multi-ethnic, you know, it's 10,000 islands, many, many different faiths. If I'm not mistaken, I think the majority of Indonesians are Muslim, and I believe they're Muslim Shafi'is for the most part.
Yep, 88%.
Yes, and I think it's mostly Shafi'i Islam, right? That's being practiced there.
Muslim Shafi'i.
Right? So they have, you know, they try to do it. I think there are 9 different states in Indonesia, and somehow they try to, I think one of them is officially ruled by Sharia law, whatever that means, okay? And so they have some funny, I was looking that up, and they have some funny fatwa, you know, that like, can you do yoga in Islam, okay? So they did a fatwa about this.
It's one of the state known as the state of Aceh.
Exactly. It was well. Thank you very much.
And they say they actually face the same situation with Brunei.
Okay, right.
So what I would say the problem with them is Shafi'is have never ever been part of an empire.
Right.
So they had no reference prior. So they have to come up with something new, just like Iran. So that's when they face the issue of like in the I think last year, right? Brunei was facing the issue of stoning LGBTs. And the rest of the world, again, there isn't exactly a stoning rule for LGBT in Islam.
That's it.
So where do you get it from?
Right, right.
So those are the issues that they are facing, and they have to deal with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So that's just an example. You know, the more innocent example I was using was yoga. Okay, but you're absolutely right. It comes down to the same thing. Yeah. So at the end of the day, you're trying to run a nation or govern a country or what have you. In the case of Indonesia, many different, you know, ethnicities and religions.
Provinces, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Tribes.
Yes. And you're trying to do that. On the one hand, you're trying to maintain a secular picture to kind of stay modern. But on the other hand, you know, your population won't allow you to somehow forget religion. So you're trying to incorporate, you know, some form of religion. And if they ask for more religion, they get Shariat. And if they ask for less, then they basically get secular law. So this is maybe the fourth category, if you will, how people are trying to handle this epistemological crisis, okay, in Islam. How countries and governments and nations are trying to cope with this, okay? And the fifth case, I would argue, is there's not really a state or a nation to kind of demonstrate this case, but this is the case of just the Muslims themselves, which is basically, I would say, a case of denial, okay? A case of complete denial. In other words, all over the world, Muslims are trying to somehow cope with, and this is especially for the diaspora, I would say, for Muslims outside of majority Muslim-ruled countries. So like the United States, like the UK. I don't know about Singapore. What's the percentages in Singapore?
13%.
13%. Okay, right. So clearly also for me, obviously in Europe, same situation. And you can see us guys in the diaspora somehow, guys and girls, trying to somehow cope with being Muslim in a non-Muslim state, which has its disadvantages, but it also has its advantages. It certainly has its freedoms, but also there's obviously a lack of community in many cases. And you're always kind of reinventing the wheel just to get something done. So you can see it from both ways, but definitely the crisis is in handing the Islamic knowledge to the next generation, because the children, you know, clearly become less and, let's say, more and more disconnected from the Islamic roots on the one hand. On the other hand, when they do discover Islam, then they discover it on their own terms, as opposed to having it forced onto them by their parents or by the government or by the police or by the military or by some kind of institution. So again, there's a minus, but there's also a plus in all of that, okay? So I would say you can take these 5 groups more or less. You can see how they're handling this epistemological crisis, okay? But one thing they all have to go through if they want to build some kind of community that we call Islam, and that's Ijma, okay? Whatever they're doing, they have to go through a process of Ijma. There's no other way, yeah? Unless, except for maybe the secularists. But the secularists have their own Ijma, but it's just not an Islamic Ijma. It's parliament, it's shura, okay? It's majlis. It's their own form of the same thing, which is how do we collectively pass a set of laws and rules and regulations by which to run the country or the nation or the state, or even the super nation like the EU, okay? So you cannot avoid Ijma. There's no avoiding it. And therefore, everything we do in Zaydi Islam needs to go through Ijma. Because, you know, Zaydiyya is not about somehow dropping out and becoming a hermit and living on a mountain and living off the grasses and hoping that the bees make honey. But Zaydiyya is pretty much about the opposite. It's pretty much about getting into the community and getting into involvement and getting into practical structuring of society from whatever can still be called an Islamic point of view, okay? Even in this postmodern society. So ijma is fundamental, and it's one of the main topics, one of the main kind of focuses of Imam Razvi in terms of Zaydi madhab in today's world and in tomorrow's world, okay? And what I'd like to do, kind of the whole reason for this, or the way that I structured this course, particularly over the next 10 classes, including today, is that, that I want to provide, one of 10 principles that I have been able to derive from Imam Razvi's teachings and present them in a postmodern ijma kind of context, and have you guys go into your teams and basically work on it and come back with your ijma, okay? Because maybe in 20 years, it's going to be you sitting in some position of authority, and people are going to need you to structure decisions and to work in a fundamentally Islamic way, okay? It's fundamentally Islamic, and we know that, especially as Zaydi, we take the position that Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu was elected also through shura and through ijma, if you will, okay? Of course we follow Imam Ali, there's no question, yeah? But nonetheless, we accept the result. I mean, because they got together, they talked about it, and there was a vote. So what can you do, Yes, there are other things in the background. Yes, things happened afterward. I'm sorry for the Ithna Sharia when I say this, but there was an election and everyone agreed. So, so ijma is fundamentally Islamic. And still today you find that if you want to solve the epistemological crisis and still maintain an Islamic framework, you need to broaden your concept of theology, okay? You need to broaden it to the point where not only can you invite scientists of other fields, be it medicine is the huge topic today, obviously, be it nuclear sciences, be it renewable energy, be it infrastructure, be it technology, architecture, arts, and music, and everything, any subject you want to take, okay? You need to have the experts in those fields reporting back into the ijma. And this is something that the traditionalists don't like to hear, and this is something that also the fundamentalists, in the sense of the Wahhabis and these guys, they don't like to hear, because they think they can do it by themselves. But obviously all of those states that have tried to do it have been complete failures, okay? And so this is the basic principle of ijma, and in today's postmodern situation, at least according to the discussions that we had with Imam Razvi during his teachings, and I'd like to put this forward to you, obviously, in a moment, and that will be part of your homework, so to speak, for next time. But we did jump ahead a little bit of ourselves. So actually, it's your turn to present what you guys...
More of buying time for Rashid.
What's that?
But since I think more of buying time from Rashid, but I think he's probably got caught up something, I guess.
That's no problem.
That's no problem. To my text either.
No worries. He'll be able to watch the video afterward. But in any case, just to let you know that this video will end after 5 minutes. I've just neglected to upgrade my Zoom account, so I'll have to upgrade that. So apologies for that, but we can jump back in the call once this runs out. So I'll let you know about 30 seconds before it runs out. And then we can jump back in a new call. So we just have to click the link again. And then we should be able to get back in, okay? Sure. So before we go into, I know you guys might have questions on that, comments, everything, and I really want to encourage a discussion and debate on that, but can you guys please present to me somehow, did you have a chance to talk about the origins of Bukhari's Zaydiyya and maybe compare it to other fields of Zaydiyya? Because I certainly had interesting discussions with the more like Yemeni style guys that are in the group. That were sending me direct messages and so on. So I'm interested in your points of view.
I think Logan would agree with me that we seem to have more questions than actual discussions.
Yeah.
That's not fair.
I mean, we did
There would not
discuss,
be agreement,
but
guys.
I guess we are. I mean, we did discuss, but I think we were discussing from different perspectives, right? So then we start to question is, okay, is this really the perspective of Bukhari Zais, or is just our perspective of it? So that's where the clarity has to be sought, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess the discussion we had started off with was, how does the Zaydiya offer a unique ability to adjust to the context of the time, right? And so I think one of the things that I brought up was that there seems to be so I said that the Zaydi concept of an imam and for a particular time and geographical region could lead to a greater flexibility because it allows adaptation to context. And actually, I think I said that the conversations about the Zaydi Bukhari versus Zaydi Hadawi conversations that were happening on the page were a good example. Is that there doesn't have it shows that there doesn't have to be uniformity in all matters. In fact, it seems like with the concept of the imam in the Zaydiya, there very likely won't be uniformity of thought on matters, because it'll depend on who your imam is. And so there does seem to be this allowance for diversity for your region, but also with you still have maintaining the leadership of the imam. But one thing that came up was that we couldn't figure out, though, what the point, I guess, just to put it this way, like, we couldn't really figure out, like, what makes the imam special, for example,
or how is he appointed, for example, right?
Yeah, how is the imam appointed, and how, for example, is the because we were trying to figure out, like, what does the imam,
does he need to be a Sayyid? Correct.
Yeah, does he he needs to be a Sayyid typically, right? And then if it has to be a Sayyid, then it's actually presented a challenge to us, because we're like, well, then what makes, then in that way it seems like the Zaydiya would be less flexible, because if you have to find a Sayyid to be your leader versus maybe, for example, like more modernist, progressive, just regular Sunni Muslims who can just,
or even Ruhollah Khomeini or like that, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So whereas others can just find anybody to serve as a mujtahid and give fatwas on things. It almost seems like the Zaydiya would be more limited because they have to find somebody who's a Sayyid. So that's kind of something that came up that Rashid had brought attention to. So
excellent
so that's why Muhammad's saying it brought up more questions, because we're like, well, then perhaps there's something we're not understanding. I think is
something that we might have missed.
It's about to end, so let me just stop you there. It's a brilliant question. We'll pick it up after the next link. Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
sure.
guys, thanks a lot.
Okay. No
Back
problem.
in a second.
Okay.